Hi friends, so we meet again for the 25th lecture of Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology in collaboration with its social media partner Ganga Jamni Heritage. I actually feel proud that we have been continuing the series without any break since the last 4 months and presenting before you scholars of repute to present their views about various aspects of our joint past. All these lectures, talks, and discussions are curated live before you on YouTube and Facebook, except perhaps one, and remain available on our two channels so that anyone can hear them at their own convenience later on. Hope some of you would be subscribing to the YouTube channels to avail this academic repository which is thus being created. Today, we have another great scholar with yet another interesting topic to discuss. This scholar teaches at the University of Rutgers in Newark, New Jersey. And that scholar is Dr. Audrey Truschke, who has emerged as a favorite whipping girl for the Hindutva Brigade after her most popular book on Aurangzeb. Her book, Aurangzeb, The Man and the Myth, created ripples all over the world, especially the Indian subcontinent. It was published in 3 different editions, one for the first world, another for India, and the third for Pakistan. It has also been translated in various languages, including Hindi, Urdu, and Bengali. But apart from all the hype and controversies, her first book, Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at Mughal Court, which was published by Penguin in 2006, remains a first-class academic endeavor delving into how and why the Mughals, one of the most powerful imperial powers of the time, poured immense energy into drawing Sanskrit thinkers to their courts, adopted and adapted Sanskrit-based practices, translated dozens of Sanskrit texts into Persian, and composed Persian accounts of Indian philosophy. A third book, The Language of History, Sanskrit Narratives of Muslim Pasts, has just been published, once again by Penguin. It is to be released in India on 18th January, that is just a few days from now. This book is supposed to analyze a hitherto overlooked group of histories on Indo-Muslim or Indo-Persian political events, namely a few dozen Sanskrit texts that date from 1190s until 1721. It also seeks for the first time to collect, analyze, and theorize Sanskrit histories of Muslim-led and later, as Muslims became an integral part of Indian cultural and political worlds, Indo-Muslim rule as a body of historical materials. This archive lends insights into formulations and expressions of pre-modern political, social, cultural, and religious identities. Welcome, Dr. Audrey Truschke. Thank you once again to concede my request. Once by coming over to AMU in August 2018 to deliver 2 lectures, and then now to speak on History Before Us, Sanskrit Narratives of Indo-Muslim Rule. Dr. Audrey Truschke, over to you. Your mic, please.
Sorry. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It is really my pleasure to be speaking once again at Aligarh Muslim University, this time virtually, of course, and that is my only regret, is that I cannot be with you all physically there. As Professor Rezavi mentioned, I spoke in Aligarh last in summer of 2018, and one of the lectures was on this project, which then was a sort of ongoing book and research project. It was far from complete, and now it's complete. So I hope you all sort of enjoy seeing kind of how it's all turned out. Okay, so I need to make sure my PowerPoint is visible. So is the PowerPoint visible, Nadim? Are we good?
It is.
Wonderful. All right. So as Professor Rezavi mentioned, I have this book, The Language of History. It's out in the United States. It'll come out in a couple of days in India. And I want to sort of tell you all about it. So to kind of open up the discussion, I want to talk about archives and sort of what sources we use to understand and access the past. All of you at Aligarh Muslim University are, of course, very familiar with sort of primary source research, right? It's sort of what you all are known for. So when we talk about Indo-Muslim history or Indo-Persian history, whatever we want to call this, and I'll have something to say about wording later, generally speaking, we use Persian text. Right? Tarikhs, farmans, akhbarats, news reports, right? People use other sources, of course. I've argued for Sanskrit texts. People use architecture, but by and large, Persian medium materials are the sort of bedrock of what we use to understand Indo-Muslim rule from the late 12th century into the 18th century. And when we read these texts, we get a particular vision of various kinds of Indo-Muslim kings. Let me give you an example of the Mughals, right? The sort of biggest show in town. If we look at Persian sources only, what we see Mughal kingship as very much as Timurid kingship. We see that they have a strong Central Asian heritage, and we see that they strongly emphasize Persianate learning, right? Persian medium learning. Certainly, there's a lot of truth in this, right? The Mughals certainly saw themselves this way. I think it's a little bit more complicated than a sort of straight up Timurid Central Asian Persianate, kind of way of seeing the Mughals. And that's largely what my first book, Culture of Encounters, was about. But more or less, what you see on the screen now, this is the history before us. This is one of many plays that I will have on the title of my talk, right? But is it accurate? I think to a large degree it is. But is it the full story? What if we simply read a different archive, a different set of historical materials? While essentially, quite possibly all scholars who work on the Indo-Muslim or Indo-Persian period are aware of Persian medium histories. Not all scholars who work on this period are aware that there is a robust body of historical materials written in Sanskrit. These works are written by pre-modern India's Hindu and Jain elites. They also deal with Indo-Muslim rule, including its associated violence and its extensive cultural changes. Now, as I said, whereas all scholars are aware of the Persian material, not all are aware of the Sanskrit materials, much less the nature of this parallel body of works. So this book that I have coming out analyzes these Sanskrit historical works on Indo-Muslim political events. I talk about roughly 36 works in the book in total, and I'll give you a partial list in just a moment. But I want to emphasize at the outset that I am not dealing here with one-offs, right? With a sort of, exceptional text written by some guy. It's kind of a random thing, right? 36 that's a pretty robust number. This is a robust body of historical works. Second thing I want to point out at the outset, and you can see it on the slide, is note the time span of these materials. The first text is written in the 1190s, and the final two texts are written in the late 1710s, early 1720s. That is essentially the entire time span of Indo-Muslim rule. So from the moment the Ghurids roll into northern Delhi and overthrow the Chauhans in Ajmer, people are writing about that in Sanskrit all the way through to the fracturing of the Mughal Empire. Now, I wrote this book with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is a US government organization, and I'm always supposed to mention that. So I guess there's still something good coming out of the US government, but let's not dwell on that too much. As I said, the book comes out in a couple of days in India. I want to do three things with you all in my talk today. I want to tell you a little bit about the general contours of the project. Second, I want to talk about why no one has written a book quite like this before. And then third, I want to give you three case studies. And that's really the meat of the talk. I'll delve into some of the Sanskrit text and show you some of my findings and illustrate some of the broader themes of the book. Let me start with general contours. Here you see an incomplete list of texts. It is incomplete because if I put roughly 35 to 36 text titles on a slide, you wouldn't be able to read it, right? Be too small. I'm not going to run through all of them, but let me just point out a couple of things. First, about half of these works are authored by Jains. The other half are authored by Brahmins. By including by sort of showcasing half of the works that are authored by Jains, I really am very deliberately trying to counter a Brahmanical-centric view that persists quite strongly in the study of Sanskrit literature. Jains are not interlopers. They are not footnotes to Sanskrit literary history. They are full participants in this tradition, as I see it. Second general thing I want to point out is geographic diversity. These texts record events across the subcontinent, literally from Kashmir down to Tamil Nadu. When I get to my specific examples, I will tell you about texts from both Kashmir and Tamil Nadu. Also, what we see here is a sort of clustering of regional traditions, right? So the Raja Tarangini authors, they're sort of clustered together and they're all reading one another. The 6 to 8 Jain authored texts on the Mughals that I'm not giving you the full titles of due to space constraint here, they're sort of clustered together. And I think we are so accustomed these days to thinking of Sanskrit as a cosmopolitan language, right? As a language that stretches across time and space. That is true, but people did not always use it to speak across time and space. People used Sanskrit to speak to very local audiences, right? And that's very much the case with the overwhelming, if not all of the works that I deal with here. Last sort of general theme I want to note is that this is what I call in the book a disjointed tradition. Outside of regional clusters, these authors were not reading one another, so far as I can tell. So the Raja Tarangini guys, they read each other, right? But they didn't read the Prithvi Raja Vijaya necessarily. One of them did, so that's a bad example. They didn't read the Madhura Vijaya, right? Or the Hamira Mahakavya. By and large, not reading one another. And I think this actually makes the tradition all the more interesting to study because it means that talking about Indo-Muslim rule was not a subject of casual or imitative interest for Sanskrit intellectuals. Rather, this is a subject that individual writers in very different times and places kept returning to again and again. And they kept reinventing the wheel of writing history in Sanskrit in order to address this sort of broad set of cultural changes. Let me turn to the question of why it took till now. Why did it take till 2021 for someone to write a book quite like this? And I, of course, want to recognize that people have worked on individual ones of these texts. Other people have written books on history in Sanskrit, although they have sort of defined it very differently than how I defined it and included different text. But no one has sort of collected this body of materials and theorized it as a usable archive like I do. Now, part of the pressure to explain this question, why other modern scholars have ignored Sanskrit histories, comes from the fact that they are available. All of the books, all of the texts almost all of the texts that I work on in the book are printed. Some of them were printed in the 19th century, right? You can find PDFs of them online freely and legally. So to any scholar who reads Sanskrit, these texts have been available for a long time. Even the image in the middle here, I'm showing you a manuscript of Ganga Devi's Madhura Vijaya from Lahore, and I'm showing that mainly because it adds a little bit of color to my screen, okay? But even that text, it's printed. I worked from printed editions for it, all right? What explains the neglect of materials that are literally laying in plain sight, right? That are available to anyone who reads Sanskrit and knows how to, has access to library resources. I think the answer is modern academic biases, right? Bad ideas in the academy that live on. Now, we don't talk about this thing so often. It is so much easier to talk about other people's biases and other people's bad ideas. And especially if you follow me on Twitter, you know that I spend a lot of time doing that. All right. But you know what? We have some problems in the academy as well. And so I want to work through with you 3 reasons, 3 bad ideas that have blocked scholars from seeing this archive as such until now. This is the first bad idea. There's no history in Sanskrit. Now, you all probably recognize this. This is a subtype of the sort of, Orientalist idea that India has no history whatsoever. It's false in the general and it's false in the particular as well. Now, you might look at this and you might think, does anyone really say that anymore? Like, isn't that just an outdated idea? I concur that few people say this overtly, but I would argue that many Sanskrit scholars act as if this were the case. This is an argument made by omission, by what people do not study. Now, it's very difficult to cite a lack, but consider a couple of indications. Advanced Sanskrit as a course is most often taught as alternating between Shastra and Kavya, right? Philosophy and poetry. There is no room there for history. Another example, the World Sanskrit Conference was held in Vancouver, Canada in July of 2018. Now, the World Sanskrit Conference is held every 2 to 3 years. It's the largest gathering of Sanskritists on earth. Literally thousands of us come together for this. Now, the one in July 2018 hosted 24 sections, each of which met over multiple days. 24 sections. The word history appeared in the title of a single section. It was paired with art, architecture, and epigraphy. The next World Sanskrit Conference is currently scheduled for 2022 and have already announced a similar lineup of sessions that sidelines history. Now, while I'm talking about the World Sanskrit Conference, let me point out to you that it has deeper problems. The conference in July of 2018 featured sexist treatment of female speakers and straight-up heckling of a Dalit Sanskrit scholar by upper caste scholars. The conference also hosted a BJP politician. This is indicative of the World Sanskrit Conference's intellectually compromising and totally inappropriate links with the Hindu right wing. Now, I'm digressing a bit from pre-modern Sanskrit histories here, but this is a digression with a point. We really should talk more about our own demons in the academy, whether those demons are a prejudicial refusal to take pre-modern Sanskrit history seriously, or misogyny, an internal class system, and extreme nationalism that is weighing down Indology. Now, many of these are problems in India, and there are problems in the United States, where I live and teach as well. Particularly Hindutva and sort of creeping Hindutva ideology and acceptance of it among Sanskrit scholars is an increasing and accelerating issue right now in the Western academy. And among other things, my book calls out American-based Sanskrit studies on this point and also for its extreme sexism. Now, I can't do everything in a single talk, so I'm going to leave off here with our modern social issues, and I'm going to return to sort of my issues of people denying written history in pre-modern Sanskrit. Here's the second bad idea that's prevented us from seeing this archive until now. There's no real history in Sanskrit. Now, the idea here is that in order to qualify as, quote, history, a text must be close enough to modern Western history. The problem is, this is a rigged game. If you go looking for modern Western history anywhere except in the modern West, you of course will not find it. You are doomed to find only absence. Instead of imposing Western ideas on pre-modern India, I want to sort of turn to pre-modern Sanskrit texts and see what they thought history was and sort of work from there, right, to the extent possible. And so when I looked at these pre-modern Sanskrit histories, and I sort of looked for any kind of basic definition or guidance, like what was history writing for you guys, I found that they thought that you wrote history through and as poetry. So I take my cue from somebody like Srivara, who wrote, "On this earth that is plagued by anarchy and dark with constant turmoil, who can shed things on the light of the past without the light of poetry?" It's a lovely verse, it's a lovely idea, and I would argue it's actually not so different from today. After all, a sort of a list of names and dates, right? Dates and events, that sort of thing. We call that a timeline, right? Written history, it's all the words between the names and dates. It's really in the narrative. Now, people like Hayden White have said this for a long time. You have a representative Hayden White quote on your screen there. But the bottom line is that this is hard for many people to accept, right? That history is in the narrative to a great degree, because it means that history is to some degree subjective. And then we have to face the difficult question, well, what does it mean to subjectively strive for accuracy? I recognize the difficulties there, and I recognize the threats. But for me, looking at these pre-modern Sanskrit texts, I do not want to write our modern anxieties onto them any longer. And so, while I remain fiercely invested in facts as a modern historian, I recognize that my pre-modern counterparts did not always share my view on that, right? I want to get back at what they thought history was. And what I found reading these Sanskrit works is that they thought that it was a sort of rich and diverse range of things. There is no overarching thesis about Sanskrit histories of Indo-Muslim rule that emerges in my book, and that's a key point. There was never a singular Sanskrit way of writing about Indo-Persian rulers. Now, let me take this opportunity to mention that just as there's sort of no single way of writing about the Indo-Muslim past in Sanskrit, there's also no genre of history in Sanskrit either. So if you thought it was itihasa, I disagree. I think that's better translated as lore or myth. The texts that I deal with in this book fall in a wide variety of genres and sort of pseudo-genres, Partavali, Rajavali, Purana, Vijaya, Prabandha, and of course, overall, Kavya. Right? That's the biggest one. Now, because there's no history genre in Sanskrit, there's no Shastra on it either, right? There's no sort of philosophical core text that tells you how to write history in Sanskrit. So what I did in the book is I came up with a sort of very loose definition, working definition of history. It gave me enough guidance to identify the sorts of texts I wanted to include without sort of shackling them and forcing me to kind of parse out, well, which parts are history and which aren't, right? Yeah, I do none of that in the book. Let me turn to our third bad idea here, which is that there's nothing on Islam in Sanskrit. Now, whereas almost no one is going to say our first bad idea, and there's more middling opinions on the second idea, a lot of people have said the third idea. Prominent scholars have written recently in print, there's nothing on Islam in Sanskrit. Now, it is generally, although not universally, true that there's limited interest amongst pre-modern Sanskrit intellectuals in Islamic theology. Right? That's more or less true. But don't we all agree by now that Islamic cultures consist of so much more than theology? I think we actually still have a lot of baggage about this. I think that we still, as a scholarly community, reify Islam into high theology so often. I name and reject that in the book project, including at the level of our own terminology. So perhaps most sort of prominently and obviously, especially to other academics, I do not use the word Islamic kit, right? Because I feel that it adds letters to and thus distances itself from Islam. For me, you cannot study Islam in history without studying Islamic cultures. Those are the same thing, so I don't see a need for separate vocabulary. This, incidentally, is part of why I use the term Indo-Muslim, and I think that's probably a little bit less striking. That phrase Indo-Muslim is still pretty widely used in India, but that will be a bit more striking to my colleagues overseas. Right? That's a term that has fallen more out of favor in the United States, but I like it. I think it's inclusive and sort of serves my needs. So that's a bit on the sort of general contours and the modern positioning of my project. Let me now turn to specific examples. So I've sort of highlighted or put in blue or whatever here on the slide, the sort of text I'm going to talk about. Okay, and I said I'm going to do 3 case studies, but 2 of those are paired, so I'll tell you about 5 texts. All right. My sort of core questions looking at these are, how did these authors talk about Indo-Muslim rule and Indo-Muslim political figures? How did they approach writing history? Another play on history before us. What was history before us, right? I swear I'll stop with those at some point. And of course, what was the sort of shifting perception of the Muslim other? And one thing that I discovered reading these texts is that so often they saw the folks that they were writing about as neither particularly Muslim nor as other. Right? Let me start with Ganga Devi's Madhura Vijaya. Right? And I'm going to go in chronological order here. So Ganga Devi, right? Devi, she was a woman. She was a Vijayanagara queen, okay? And while I want to say that while I was delighted to work on a text written by a woman, she's a very good poet, very nice to read. This is the only text written by a woman, right? In my book, the pre-modern Sanskrit tradition is incredibly male-dominated, and that is one of many things that I sort of deal with in the book and name explicitly. Okay, so Ganga Devi. Vijayanagara queen, she wrote the Madhura Vijaya, victory at Madurai, around 1380, give or take a decade. The text commemorates King Kampan's 1371 decimation of the Sultanate of Madurai. Now, if you need a history reminder, I'm sure none of you do, but just in case, the Sultanate of Madurai had broken away from the Tugluks in 1333. It lasted almost 40 years as an independent Muslim-led kingdom deep in Tamil Nadu. Now, of course, when you go to Madurai today, most people go to see the famous Meenakshi temple, but you can still find traces of the Sultanate. There are the graves of 3 of the sultans are in and around Madurai. 2 are in the city proper, and the third is about 15 kilometers outside of Madurai. All are in Sufi dargahs. Now, Ganga Devi's text, it is a text of what I think I call it this in the book. Maybe I don't. Anyways, it's a text of sort of total violence, right? It's a text about the end of a dynasty. Now, in Ganga Devi's case, she is narrating the overthrow of a, quote, Muslim kingdom at the hands of a, quote, Hindu dynasty. Now, that's using very crude modern terminology. There's a lot of reasons why we might not want to use that modern terminology. But I do want to underscore that I deal with these sort of texts of total violence sort of going both ways religiously, right? So Hindu dynasties, decimate Muslim ones and vice versa. And one sort of thing I do throughout the book is I grapple with this violence and the literary use of it. Because Ganga Devi, like any good Sanskrit poet, she celebrates and praises gore on the battlefield, right? And if you're not familiar with Sanskrit poetry concerning battles, right, you need a real strong stomach to read this stuff. There's corpses all over the place. There's rivers of blood. Headless corpses wandering around, sort of tripping over dead bodies, right? Like, it's pretty intense stuff. And this was poetry in Sanskrit. So in other words, Ganga Devi, she treated the annihilation of a dynasty and a mass amount of death to be fodder for beautiful literature. I argue in the book that this praise of violence, both against Muslim-led dynasties and enacted by them, is actually a strategy of inclusion. Right? So it's not about making them out to be particularly violent. It's about including them as more or less like other Indian kings. And this is because in Sanskrit literature, you praise a king in part by saying that he is quite violent. Right? This was a praise. It was a good thing. And Indo-Muslim kings for Ganga Devi were fully welcomed and embraced within that worldview. So for example, she said, and she says in other ways, that the Sultanate of Madurai is just like other Indian polities. Right? So for example, Kampan had 2 major enemies, according to Ganga Devi. The Sambhuvarayas, led by King Champa, and the Sultanate of Madurai. She writes that the Sultanate was the tree trunk, the prakanda, and the Sambhuvarayas were the branches, the shaka, both of which King Kampan should burn to the ground. And indeed, that's what he does. right? He sort of plays out the metaphor. He hits on and beats the Sambuvarayas, and then a decade later, he overthrows the Sultanate. Now, Ganga Devi's text, as I mentioned, it's wonderful poetry, right? She was a very good Sanskrit poet. I very much enjoyed reading this work. But there's also historical specificity, okay? And I found the historical specificity in Ganga Devi and in other authors to be expressed in tropes, in Sanskrit literary conventions. This is a point on which I depart from many prior Sanskrit scholars, modern Sanskrit scholars, who have worked on this text or other sort of individual works. Many people have said, oh, if it's a trope, if it's a Sanskrit convention, it can't be historically specific because it's just a trope. I see this differently. I think that Sanskrit literature, Sanskrit literary culture, has arguably the largest set of conventions and tropes on earth. A Sanskrit poet always could choose, 25 other tropes instead of the one that he or she chose. And so I think that that allowed them to express historical specificity through tropes and through sort of rhetorical language. Let me give you some examples. And this is a part of the text in the 8th chapter where Ganga Devi is talking about and alluding to earlier Muslim-led campaigns by the Khaljis and the Tughlaqs that sort of led to the establishment of the Sultanate of Madurai. So in verse 8.1, okay, first verse of chapter 8, the verse is largely incomplete, but we do have a clear reference to Chidambaram. This is where Malik Kafur, a Khalji general, damaged a Shiva temple in 1311 while he was on campaign. The next verse, verse 2, and I've given it to you here in English, mentions the sacking of the Sri Rangam temple later that same year by the same forces. Now, both of these events were important precursors to establishing the Sultanate of Madurai. They're both discussed in other Sanskrit texts. They're also on the road in that order from Kanchi, Kampan's capital, to Madurai. Right? So she's chronicling the geography of how his forces marched. A few verses later, she mentions the Kaveri River. It's a real river. It flows by Sri Rangam. She talks about it flowing crookedly. So it's nice poetry, but again, real geography. Now, one thing I did when reading the Mathura Vijaya is I looked for any way that Ganga Devi defined the Sultanate of Madurai or any other Muslim peoples as different. But did she describe them as different in any way? So sort of going through the entire text, putting everything together, here's what I came up with. It's pretty generic. She describes the Sultanate and associated Muslim peoples as Yavana and Tulushka. Okay, Tulushka is a well-known southern variant of the more commonly known Turushka. All right. Both of these terms, they're originally ethnic, right? Originally Greek and Turk, but by this period, by the 14th century, they're just standard Sanskrit terms for Muslims of any ethnic background. Okay. She says in separate verses that Sultanate men and women both drink alcohol. I want to flag two things. One, that's a decidedly un-Islamic accusation. All right. The second is that her verse on women drinking alcohol, she uses the term Yavani. It's a sort of feminine version of Yavana. It plays in that and in its imagery directly on a verse from Kalidasa, right? A Sanskrit poet from nearly a millennium before who wrote before there even were Muslims, right? Now, she calls the Sultanate and associated folks meat eaters and cow killers. Steeped as we are in sort of modern Indian politics, you might hear something specific to Muslims there, but you really shouldn't. These are both pretty old Brahmanical anxieties. They go back centuries before this. Brahmin writers generally were often accusing people who did not adhere to sort of Brahmanical rich sort of purity norms of being meat eaters and cow killers. This included Muslims, but it was not limited to Muslims. Right, so there's nothing Muslims really specific there. The greatest specificity that I found that Ganga Devi expresses about the Sultanate had to do with their language. She says, and it's just one verse, the screeching of owls in the old groves does not grate on me as much as the chatter of Persian words from parrots who live in Sultanate Yavana homes. So Persian, she didn't like the language. And that's honestly not very surprising. right? Sanskrit sort of philosophy and thought has a limited set of languages that it admits is real speech. Persian is not on that list. Now, this too had its own history. Jayanaca, the sort of first Sanskrit intellectual who wrote a full text about Indo-Muslim rule, in his case, the Ghurid incursions against the Chohans, he too said that it sort of had problems with them speaking Persian. Now, Ganga Devi did not read Jayanaca, so far as I can tell. I found no evidence of that. So it's not that she's intentionally repeating or echoing him, it's that they're working from a shared sort of playbook. So in short, Ganga Devi, she sees the Sultanate as different, but her main hang-up with them, it doesn't have to do with religion. It really has to do with language. And that actually fits with what we know about Vijayanagara culture more broadly and the Vijayanagara penchant for including aspects of Indo-Persian rule and embracing them as part of their own ruling ideology. Other scholars have written about this with various titles used by Vijayanagara kings that include Persian words. I'll give you just one example that, frankly, I stumbled across in Kanchipuram. All right. At one of the temples there, I saw this. This is a photo of the same statue, okay, just from the two different sides, right? It's from a marriage hall built around 1550 CE, so a bit later. Okay, but this is the same guy, and look at his face and clothes. On one side, he's clean shaven and wearing a dhoti, and on the other side, he's wearing sort of Indo-Persian sort of full dress and has a nice mustache, right? So the Vijayanagara rulers themselves were very interested in sort of having it both ways and building some sort of cross-cultural or syncretic, some sort of mixed ruling culture. Let me turn to my second case study, which are the Kashmiri Raja Charangiris. Okay, so we're moving from India's deep south to the sort of far north. Now, most people are most familiar with Kalhana's Raja Charangini from the mid-12th century. Okay, but that's only the first Raja Charangini. There's a bunch after him. I do talk about Kalhana in the book, especially because thinking about Kalhana has shaped, to the extent that there's been sort of modern Sanskrit thought on written history in pre-modernity and pre-modern Sanskrit. Kalhana has shaped that conversation. So I do talk about him in the book. But today I'm going to talk about his two successors, Jonaraja and Srivara. So Jonaraja wrote in 1459, and then his student Srivara wrote in 1486. Both of their texts, somewhat confusingly, are also called Raja Charangini. Now, both of these men, they're both Brahmins, they're both writing in Sanskrit, and they both were also Shahmiri court poets. Okay? Jonaraja worked for Zainul Abidin, and Srivara worked for his successors. So I want to emphasize that their texts, it's very interesting. They sort of double as a sort of continuation of this Raja Charangini sort of Kashmiri Sanskrit tradition, and then also as official sponsored Shahmiri court histories. Now, Jonaraja, he starts where Kalhana left off in the mid-12th century. So at a certain point in his text, he has to introduce Shahmiri rule, right? When the Shahmiri rulers, these Muslim kings, come to power in Kashmir. All right, and this happens in 1339. This is the verse that Jonaraja uses to introduce Shahmiri rule. All right, so we've had other people, now it's the Shahmiris. It reveals its nature all around by the sentient and insentient forms it creates. Its luster surges through producing space and time, whether it be the self, Shiva, Vishnu, Brahma, Buddha, Jinna, or action itself. Praise to that divine one. This is a very nice introductory verse to a sort of new section of the text, okay? It refers to Jain thought, to Buddhist thought, to a range of Hindu deities. This places the Shahmiri rulers in a sort of very broad kind of Sanskrit-based cultural context. But note what it doesn't contain. It doesn't refer to Islam, right? There's no overt reference to anything Muslim in this verse. No Allah, no Khuda, no nothing. In other words, this introductory verse could have been written for any Indian ruler, Muslim or not. And I think it signals the degree to which Jonaraja intends to treat the Shahmiris as indistinguishable from rulers belonging to different religious traditions. All right? And indeed, that's what he does. The last 2/3 of Jonaraja's work concerns the Shahmiris, And by and large, there is very little sort of specifically Muslim about them from Jonaraja's perspective. Let me give you just one more example, right? And this comes from a part of the text where Jonaraja is praising his patron, Zain al-Abidin. Now, Zain al-Abidin is paying Jonaraja to write this work. Okay, so praising Zain, totally normal and accepted, right? So nothing need to be explained further there. But look at how he does this, right? Here's one verse. King Zain felt immense sorrow that the region had been oppressed by Malaycha rulers. And so step by step, he rescued the region, as Vishnu had done for the earth when it was oppressed by demons. In order to make sense of this verse, I think we have to understand that Jonaraja is saying that Zain al-Abidin is not a Malaycha, which was the single most standard Sanskrit term for Muslims. And Jonaraja uses Malaycha to mean Muslim in this text and in others. I think it signals the degree to which he goes to indicate Shah Miri integration into more traditional forms of Indian kingship. Now, I could give you 10 examples of this from Jonaraja's work, and I give more in the book. I don't think 10, but I do give some more. It continues throughout, right? Here's just a couple. Both Jonaraja and Srivara say that the Shah Miri is descended from Shiva, all right? Jonaraja has one part where he's talking about Shah Miri ancestors, and he says that one of them was a second Arjuna, followed by his son Babruvahana. And so sort of references to kind of Hindu mythology and stories. He says that Zain al-Abidin listened to Sanskrit text and was friendly to Brahmins. Now I want to talk about that friendly to Brahmins bit. Okay, that's a standard Sanskrit praise of kings. It's a good thing to sort of be friendly to Brahmins. It was also, of course, of direct relevance to Jonaraja as well as his student Srivara, who were both Brahmins, trying to depend on Shah Miri largesse. In fact, Jonaraja, I think it's fair to say he was obsessed with Brahmanical privilege, right? It runs throughout his work. It's just very front and center, all right? And just, I mean, here's just some things that Zain al-Abidin did, according to Jonaraja, that sort of entrenched this special place of Brahmins in Kashmiri society. Now, this defense of Brahmanical privilege, this was not new, okay? Jonaraja certainly didn't invent this. It also hasn't gone away. Some of you may remember this photo of Jack, Twitter's CEO, right, holding this sign, Smash Brahmanical Patriarchy. It's from 2018. I'll tell you one thing, I bet Jack has never forgotten it. It prompted a huge social media storm and backlash. I'll bet you anything he still hears from people about this. And I want to just sort of put it out there, why? I mean, Smash Brahmanical Patriarchy is essentially a human rights slogan. Like, what prompted such an incredible backlash against this? And the answer is that Brahmanical privilege lives on pretty strongly in the modern world. It's a problem. Jonaraja, by the way, would not have approved of Jack holding this sign. All right. I'm going to leave off with Jack. I'm going to return to 15th century Kashmir. Let me tell you about Srivara. Okay, so Srivara is Jonaraja's student. Jonaraja dies pretty suddenly, it appears. Srivara sort of takes over. He's the Shah Miri court poet. And a little less than 30 years later, he pens the sort of next Raja Tarangini. All right, he's writing in 1486. It's the official date, the text. Now, this is a period of immense political turmoil. Okay, there's a lot of sort of jostling for political power in Kashmir. All right, and he covers this in some detail. Okay, whereas Jonaraja had covered several hundred years, Srivara covers less than 30 years in his text. So let me just point out a couple of things about Srivara's work. One, he coins two new terms for Muslim communities, Masula and Saida. Now, this is interesting for a lot of reasons. Sanskrit had about a dozen or more terms for Muslims by this point in time. Most commonly, Malaycha, Yavana, and Truschke or Tulushka, as we saw earlier. But authors had also used Matanga, Janangama, Chandala, Shaka, Shaka, Shahi, and so forth. It seems, by coining new vocabulary, that Srivara perceived something distinctive about Muslim communities that he thought it important to express at a vocabulary level. Srivara also writes more about specific aspects of Muslim culture, more than anybody else before him in Sanskrit, but by a long shot. when I read this work, whereas with Jonah Raja, I felt like I really had to sort of wrestle with that text to get anything specific about Islam and Muslim cultures out of it. With Srivara, it was like an embarrassment of riches. And I really do hope that other scholars return to this work. Some people are working on it already. It really deserves more attention than I give it in the book project. But let me tell you about Masola and Saida. So Masola comes from the Persian Musulman, right? It refers for Srivara to foreign Muslims, most commonly, so not Kashmiri Muslims so much. He mentions that they spoke Persian. So the Persian thing lives on. They ate beef. And I think one of the most interesting things is he talks about the Masola Veda. That is a very nice cultural translation of Quran, right? By recognizing the Quran, and especially by labeling it as a Veda, he seems to recognize that Muslim communities had a sort of philosophical and religious tradition and culture that could be compared to sort of the Shad Darshana, right? The sort of six philosophical schools of thought in Sanskrit. Now, Saida was different. The Saida refers to a specific Muslim community for Srivara, the Behaqi Sayyids, okay, who exerted political power in Kashmir, often against the Kashmiri Muslim sort of community, as per Srivara's narration anyways. Now, Srivara, as I said, he writes a lot about sort of Muslim communities, and there is a recognition of sort of cultural specificity more broadly. So just some examples. He writes about the community mosque and sort of what goes on there, right? The Brihad Masjid. He talks about the celebration of Eid. He talks about minarets and architectures. He also talks about Friday prayer, and I'm giving you just this short excerpt because it illustrates once again how Sanskrit poetry can and does communicate specificity, right? So he talks about worshippers bowing down and rising again, like lines of lofty waves in a rippling lake. That is both lovely poetry. It is also an accurate description of Muslim prayer styles. Now, if Srivara recognizes a sort of Muslim community or Muslim communities, then who's not Muslim for him, right? This is a question that I asked in the text. Who else was there in Kashmir? Keep in mind that Hinduism didn't exist as a term. It wouldn't exist as a term for hundreds of years yet. The word Hindu was in usage, although very sparingly. In Sanskrit, Hindu was primarily still used in Persian and Arabic. Srivara uses the term Hinduka. Now, I think that this has been misunderstood by others who have looked at the text. People look at it, they think, oh, Hinduka. You just take away the ka, it's Hindu. Bam, we all go home. If only it was that easy. Srivara very clearly uses Hinduka to mean specifically high caste Hindus. He glosses it as Dvija sometimes, right? The four upper classes of the Varna system. And he also repeatedly uses it for Brahmins specifically. Right, sort of carrying on Jonah Raja, his teacher's obsession with Brahmanical privilege. Now, the threat to Brahmanical privilege, and Srivara does identify like threats to Brahmanical privilege. For him, it doesn't come from Muslims, right? It comes from other places. And in fact, he says very clearly that Muslims could and did support Brahmins and participate in sort of Hinduka rituals and culture. And this is interesting, right? This does not map onto sort of how we think about Hindus and Muslims today. So let me give you just one verse. He's talking about a Kashmiri royal family member at her death. And he says, all men, remembering that Gul Khatun nurtured high caste Hindu customs, using that word Hinduka, like the sun nurtures lotuses, mourned and wept bitterly. So in short, Srivara articulates religious identities, right? Sort of Muslim on the one hand, Hinduka on the other hand, but it wasn't on the one and the other hand, right? They weren't oppositional and they weren't exclusive either. It's a very different way of conceptualizing religious identities. That's a little bit on the Raja Chiranginis. Let me turn to my last case study. All right, which is Lakshmipati's works. And I will be briefest on these. So this guy, Lakshmipati, he works for Jagat Chandra, who was a Mughal vassal in Himachal Pradesh in the early 18th century. So he's sort of like a small-time guy who sort of formally submits to the Mughals. And Lakshmipati wrote for him 2 works, the Nirpati Niti Garbhita Vritta, which despite its sort of longevity in Sanskrit, I translate as political history, and the Abdullah Charita, right? Abdul's, deeds or things he did. You have the dates there, right? 1720 to 21, more or less. The topic of both is Mughal politics between 1713 and 1720. If you know much about Mughal history, you know that there were a lot of politics in that particular chunk of time. The big story is how the 2 Syed brothers, who were not members of the Mughal royal family, sort of gain power and then lose it. Okay. Now, for Lakshmipati, he basically mixes it all together, right? It's a very interesting sort of capstone on this whole tradition of Sanskrit histories of Indo-Muslim rule. Let me give you some examples, because he mixes Sanskrit and Persian, he mixes, sort of Hindu and Muslim stuff on sort of every level. So for example, on the level of cultural references, in both texts, he has parts where he talks about sons who overthrow their fathers, right? Princes who overthrow the king. And he cites, in both texts, he cites sort of back to back the example of Kamsa overthrowing Ugrasena. If you know your Sanskrit stories, you know that. And then he also cites the example of Aurangzeb imprisoning Shah Jahan, right? Drawing from the Mughal Persianate tradition. Today, it's not all that easy to find people who are versed in both sort of Mughal history and Sanskrit literature, but Lakshmipati seems to just assume that his readers will get this. He has a very nice section where he says that Mecca is the equivalent of Kashi, of Benares, right? And it's, 10 to 15 verses. And he goes on at some length. He goes so far as to say that just as the footprints of Lord Vishnu are present in Kashi and Benares, so too are the footprints of Lord Vishnu in Mecca. I'm not sure exactly what he's referring to there in Mecca, but the sort of equivalence is clear. And that section of the text is actually so striking that I actually translate it in appendix to the language of history. And that's something that I want to flag for people, that I do have a sort of appendix at the end where I translate excerpts from, I think, 8 different texts. Last but certainly not least is that Lakshmipati signals that he's not dealing with 2 cultures, but one for him at the level of language. He uses Persian vocabulary and grammar. Now, I didn't count it all, but he uses hundreds of Persian words in these 2 texts combined, possibly thousands. He even uses grammatical bits. Okay, these include the accusative marker ra and the preposition dar, in. So there's parts of the text that are arguably actually Persian in addition to being Sanskrit. So in short, for Lakshmipati, even the primary language of Indo-Muslim kingship, Persian, right, that was like the screeching of owls for Ganga Devi, even that could now be integrated into the Sanskrit world. This is a moment where the other had ceased to become other in any way, right? Lakshmipati sort of owns the other. It's not an other for him, right? This is a culture that he can embrace and play with too. So that's a bit on my case studies. In sort of brief closing, let me just talk about a few larger implications of the book. So, like everyone else, I stand in history. It's 2021, rough start to the year. I see swirling about me narratives of exclusion. Right? People talk about exclusion all the time right now. I want Sanskrit histories of Indo-Muslim rule to help us do what Riz Ahmed praises here, namely stop seeing each other as others. I think we see progression on this from Jayanika, who I didn't talk about today, but he does have a very strong othering in his text of the Gorids, to Lakshmipati, for whom there is no other. Right? This shows that change is possible. No, it's not all roses, right? I deal with a lot of othering and violence in the book, and harsh othering even. But even for someone like Jayanika, for whom the Gorids can never be Indian, they can never be integrated, even he doesn't use the rigid terms of religion, sort of Hinduism and Islam, that encase our thinking today. And I think that there is power in imagining other ways. That's a bit lofty, all right? But let me get a little bit more specific. So there is what I hope an archival upshot to what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that we ought to acknowledge an entirely new archive important to the study of Indo-Muslim history, an archive written in Sanskrit. Now, that's a little inconvenient for many scholars of this period who do not read Sanskrit, right? And there's a practical issue there. As I mentioned, I do have an appendix in the book translating some stuff. It's a sort of nod to trying to open up the archive. But there's something else as well, which is that throughout the book, I grapple with how we deal with the literary aspects of text, right? I don't try to sift out poetry from history, because you can't do that. These people wrote history as poetry, right? Like it's all together for them. And I think that, for those of us who work on Persian materials, we have a pretty rough history, right, of not of sort of sidelining literary aspects of Indo-Persian texts, right? Some older translations even just don't translate the poetry. Sometimes we focus on the history, not the literature, so on and so forth. For those who work on Persian archives, not Sanskrit ones, I think that my project does offer some analytical tools for dealing with poetic and literary aspects of your materials. I want us to give greater attention to narrative in history, right? And how I want to do this is as follows. Sanskrit histories of Indo-Muslim rule look really different than what we call history today. Okay. As a result, many people before me have condemned these texts that I work on as non-history, right? Hagiography or merely literature, only poetry. I want to turn the tables. Instead of saying this is what history is and you don't count, I want to take their ideas seriously and sort of use them to press on us. Now, in other words, I want to crack open the definition of history in the modern West. I don't want to crack it into pieces, but just like crack it open a little bit, Essentially, I want to use these works to talk about how important narrative is in the stories that we tell and how much we rely on tropes in our narration of the past. Now, please do not mistake me. I am not arguing for a reduction of the historian's craft to mere narrative. On the contrary, I think that sometimes, as historians, we fall back on narrative and tropes in lieu of proving historical causality. And I think we shouldn't do that. I think that greater attention to narrative and our own tropes can help us identify better when those are standing in for true historical argument, and thus help us tell more accurate and compelling stories about the past. We'll see if that pans out, but at the very least, I aim to introduce a group of texts, some known and some lesser known, theorized together as a usable body of historical materials that I hope can lend us unique insights into the Indian past. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope now you can see us. In fact, a very interesting lecture where you open a new archive for us, especially those working on medieval Indian history at Aligarh. You are quite correct. We have only paid attention to the Persian sources, having ignored a large number of other works, which, as you pointed out, are easily available. They have been printed. They are available even, in fact, online also they are available. But unfortunately, it is only very few scholars who have taken them up for a proper study. I think that your work is opening a new chapter for the understanding of the Mughal social history itself. The way you defined that, for example, Jona Raja, using the term Malech, not for Zainul Abidin or the ruling dynasty, but for those who were opposing it, is, a remarkable evidence of the acceptance of the fact that during that period of time, the religion of the ruling classes were actually not being emphasized or taken into account. I would also like to mention that even otherwise, we do find that terms like mujahid, terms like jihad were being used in the northern parts of India, in the Indo-Gangetic basin, as late as the 19th century, as late as 1857, for people like Rani of Jhansi and Tatya Tope, although the fact was that they were not Muslims. So these terms, militia, for example, are being used for all those who are in fact opposing Zainul Abidin, and not for the ruling dynasty itself, is a remarkable evidence which you bring out. Similarly, the fact that Srivara uses two other terms apart from Turushkas and other terms which were being used for the Muslims, the term Mosala, which is very common term, which even till date, if you go to the North Indian villages, say for example in Uttar Pradesh, the term Musalla is still being used for the Muslims. So this Mosala just reminds me of how certain of my village compatriots use the term for us there in my particular village in the Awadh region. Saida, as you rightly pointed out, is nothing but a way of saying the Sayyids, the elites of the Muslim society. And Mosala Veda, again a term which is being used for the Quran, reminds me of a Ghaznavide coin, where the Ghaznavide king issues a coin on which bilingual epigraph is there, inscriptions are there, and the term being used for the prophet is not Rasulullah, but in Sanskrit the term avatar is being used from 10th century onwards. So in fact, I find a continuity of the traditions where from the very beginning down to the fact that you came up till the Sayyid brothers forces which deal till that time, I would say that India had a very different type of a society and political setup where what is happening today is actually not found. So I think your lecture opens up new horizons for our students who are actually here hearing you, and probably this would go a long way to make them understand that to look at the past through the eyes which our government wants us to see is a very difficult proposition after all. I mean, Shagufta, are there any questions which you can put up or any comments which may have come for the lecture for Dr. Truschke? Now, there is a comment, the question by Mike Nak. No, Maruthi, Mike Nak, yeah. On Mahmud Ghaznavi coins, the Muslim kalima was written in Sanskrit as Avatameshwara, Muhammad Avatar Mahmud Narpata, as one of the first interaction between Arabic and Sanskrit languages. Yes, that is a coin which was issued, and on which it's a bilingual coin. On the one side you have the Arabic epigraph, on the other the Sanskrit one. Would you like to say something on that, Audrey?
Sure. So I mentioned the coin in the book. Obviously, how could I not? It's a very striking coin. It's very early. It's also, and I'm drawing here from other scholars, Barry Flood's written about this, it's essentially an abandoned project, right? Like it's not like that recurs repeatedly as an expression. So it's sort of interesting in that sense, if not entirely unsurprising, right? You know, I'm going back to, you know, Emperor Ashoka, you see sort of, you know, early attempts at integration, and then perhaps a little bit later, you sort of move away from that as you kind of, you know, develop and solidify your own culture.
Any other question? Yeah, Maruti Pidaparti. How is it that sensible to expect a person in court, that is sultans, to portray a negative thing about sultan, and that too about a violent praised according to you?
Okay, yeah. So So I think there's sort of two aspects of that. One is this is a recurrent question in Sanskrit studies, and I would assume in other studies as well. To what degree can we trust court poets, right? Are they not just sort of singing songbirds, to quote a famous Sanskritist? You know, do they not just sort of parrot whatever they're told? You know, the king says, write this, you do this. And so aren't they just historically worthless? So I think, like everything, you have to read critically. Just because someone wrote it down hundreds of years ago does not mean that it is true and accurate, right? I mean, this is like reading primary sources 101, is you have to read very critically. I think that Sanskrit poets were often very creative in getting in their criticism, so I don't think we should dismiss them so easily. I will add that in the case of Jonaraja and Srivara that I talked about today, there is the additional issue that they wrote in a language we are not certain that the Shahmiri kings could understand, right? I'm agnostic on this point. I do not know if Zainal Abidin or any of his successors really knew or understood Sanskrit. I think one of his sons, there's records of him like listening to Sanskrit sort of recited, even music. But I mean, understanding that and really understanding a Sanskrit kavya, those are two different things. So that may have allowed them more freedom, right? I think to get to the second point of violence. So to say that a ruler is really violent, that's usually negative in the 21st century, right? Like we criticize governments for excessive use of force. Sanskrit poets did that in reverse, right? Being violent was a good thing. That was a marker of sovereignty. It was a marker of power, right? And so I think sort of just, you know, kind of you have to sort of try to hold back our modern biases that, you know, sort of excessive use of state force is a bad thing for us. You just have to like hold that back and understand that that was actually a praise for pre-modern Sanskrit poets.
Well, I would add to that, Maruti, that, even among the documents which survive from the Mughal period, say, for example, Gujarat, or for that matter, also Awadh or Rajasthan, there are a number of documents which are bilingual in character. And what we find is sometimes the emperor is praised to the limit. In the Persian, part of the epigraph, whereas in the Sanskrit part, or the non-Persian epigraph which is attached along with that, there is another story which is narrated. So much praise as has been written in the Persian epigraph for the sultan or for the ruling elite or for the nobleman is not there, meaning thereby that possibly throughout, not only the fact that she is talking about certain kingdoms, but even otherwise, most of these people were not, they were sure that the Sanskrit epigraphs would not be read by the imperial authority. In spite of that, we do find a large number of epigraphs where, although the writer knows that probably it might not be read by the emperor himself, the praise is still there, because unlike you and me, they were not thinking in those terms as we are thinking today. Now, Maruti has a different, I think, query. Why is that you are not defending fact said by Ganga Devi when it comes to drinking and cow killing?
Well, that's an easy answer. I defend absolutely nothing about the Indian past.
That is not the job of a historian.
Correct.
The job of the historian is to narrate. It is for you to decide. Nanak Ganguly, he says, thank you for citing Hayden White. He demonstrates how the rhetorical tropes of narrative fiction create a plot where the antecedents, that is villain, generates the consequence, that is victim, and it plays with several variations of this plot, several antecedents and several consequences, as we see in the history of partition in South Asia. This is my quibble and meta-narrative.
So, okay, that's very specific. I don't know that I have a sort of, particular position on this regarding partition narratives. I would say that, so all theory for me is only valuable insofar as I can use it to produce better history. Okay, and that's not true for all academics. Many academics just want to lose themselves in, some like rabbit hole of theory, and like that's fine, have fun. Like I'm not on that train. So for me, I want to use Hayden White and his insights about narrative to help us tell better stories about the past, right? So I think some of what he says is useful, some of it isn't. In terms of meta-narratives, let me just throw out one that comes up a whole lot in the scholarship that I read, which, generally speaking about pre-modern India, which is decline. We talk about decline a lot, right? The decline of the Mughals, the decline of the Mauryans, the decline of Sanskrit literature, right? Like decline is just this huge narrative, right? This sort of sense of loss and that things are always getting worse. I'm not saying that there's never decline. Of course, there's going to be decline on certain things over time. But I think that we sort of slot in a little too easily to that. And that sort of alleviates the pressure on us to sort of actually do hard research and prove historical causality and sort of see with fresh eyes what's going on. So, it's not about sort of, saying you can't tell a certain kind of story. It's just, make sure you have the evidence for it and that you're not just telling that story because it's the easiest one to tell.
Let us have the question by Lubna Irfan. Lubna asks, when we read these texts and look at the examples, as you look of Srivara, do we come across religious identities at all? Is using the term religious identities justified? Weren't they different, more caste-related and ritual-related identities? And if yes, don't we need to find a different terminology for such community identities?
It's a great question, Lubna. So, I mean, there's so much there. Should we even be talking about religion at all? I mean, that is a Western term with particular preconceptions. When you utter the word religion, you are invoking sort of Protestant ideas about the internality of belief and things, whether you mean to or not, right? I take your point. I guess for me, I am constantly in my scholarship trying to balance sort of two things and sort of two obligations that I hold equally dear. One is I want to be as accurate as possible about the past. I want to recognize and name difference when I see it, right? So I'm totally with you. But on the other hand, I also want to be intelligible, right? And it's hard when we abandon all of the terminology that people use in the everyday world, right? Then you end up with the world where you're talking about ritual identities and Islamicate and Persianate, and like normal people who aren't academics, their eyes just glaze over. They have no idea what you're talking about. I also think there is a danger in hiding behind new terminology, right? I think I have this line in my book that, it's wishful thinking that new terms can give us better ideas, which is not to say we should never come up with new terminology, right? But the power of that is not the words themselves, it's the ideas behind it. So I don't have a clear answer to your question. Quite possibly you're right. I want to strive for both accuracy and intelligibility. So I think that's where you sort of see some of the mixture of specialized terms and non-specialized terms in much of my work.
Right. So maybe have the question of Sachin Ketkar. Sachin Ketkar asks, while the use of Sanskrit archive is fascinating, and very useful indeed. Can the use of vernacular texts of the same period combine with the Sanskrit archive to shed greater light on cultural politics of the period?
Great question. The short answer is yes, absolutely. My work needs to be supplemented with work on vernacular archives. So I will say on a personal note, when I started writing this book project, Alison Bush, who died a little over a year ago, was professor of Hindi literature at Columbia University. She was working on a sort of comparable project. I mean, not comparable, better, no doubt, would have been way, way better than my book. But she was working on historical sources written in Hindi from roughly the same period, right? I think starting a bit later, but you know. And I mean, one of my dreams and visions was always that our books would sort of come out around the same time and be read together and against each other. And Alison has left this world, and we are all the poorer for the loss of her. And the book, The Language of History, is dedicated to Alison Bush and her, you know, sort of ongoing example of scholarship and her memory with all of us. The second thing I will say is my book, it's not meant to be definitive in any way. It's meant to sort of open up this subject, both with a focus on Sanskrit texts, but also with a focus on other languages. So, you know, to the extent that people find holes in the project, and there are a lot of holes, you should fill them.
There is a question by Mr. Ali Digvijay Singh. I will ask Ali Haidar's question later on. Digvijay asks Dr. Audrey, what do you make of the Sanskrit treatises and works absolutely eschewing the subject of Islam and its theology? Is it out of disdain or plain disinterest? Or did they not delve into it because they were devoid of any bias? That is question number one. Second is there really a difference in how the Hindu and Jain scholars have recorded the events of the period?
So on the first question, so, and I mentioned this briefly in the talk, that, you know, if you look at philosophical treatises comparing, you know, the Shaddarshana, the sort of 6 conventional, you know, kind of philosophical positions within, broadly speaking, Hindu thought, as well as Jain and Buddhist positions, sometimes Gnostica positions as well, sort of atheist, materialist positions. Generally speaking, Islam is left out of that. So I have a couple of thoughts on this. One, to the extent that scholars have looked at those texts, said, hey, there's nothing on Islam here, so there's nothing on Islam in Sanskrit. That's like pretty shoddy work, right? Like if you look at one set of texts and you don't find something on the subject you're looking for, like maybe you should look at a different set of texts, right? Which is what I do in the project, right? I didn't find discussions of Islam and Islamic thought in these sorts of hard philosophical texts, but I did find them in kavyas all over the place. In terms of, you know, sort of making sense of that kind of philosophical disinterest, I mean, you know, other scholars would probably have better insight on this, but my sense is that writing those philosophical works, it was not a response to sort of what was around people at the moment. And one sort of strong indication of that is that, you know, scholars of various schools were arguing against Buddhist thought hundreds of years after there had ceased to be sort of active Buddhist communities on the Indian subcontinent. Like this was an exercise sort of rooted in the past and in some sort of maybe a historical memory, or maybe a sense that sort of rehashing these debates held philosophical value in their present. But it wasn't about, you know, it wasn't like you wake up, you look around your village, oh, who's here? We should like talk about what they think, right? So I think it was just a little bit more disconnected in that sense. In terms of the second question, was there a difference between how Hindu and Jain scholars recorded events? Not on the basis of religious identity. And one sort of smaller modern bias that I push back against in the book is the idea that specifically Jain scholars always wrote as Jains, right? These were more like Sanskrit intellectuals who happened to be Jain, but for many of them, I don't really think that their Jain identity comes out strongly in the works that I read, which is not to say it does not come out in other more sort of religiously well, now I'm, because of Lubna, I'm rethinking my use of religiously. But anyways, maybe their Jain identity comes out in more religiously focused works of theirs, but not necessarily in the historical works.
Right. There is a question by Ali Haider. Ali Haider asks a question. Will you not write an article about the current total dishonest move by NCRT, saying that Aurangzeb didn't provide land grants to temples? Now, before Dr. Truschke answers, I will just answer to Ali Haider. I'm sorry, I mean, I'm preempting you. You answer it afterwards. Audrey has already dealt with this in her book on Aurangzeb, number one. Number two, there is enough material on board which can be consulted if they really want to do that. Third, NCRT is totally, wrong in giving that type of answer. I mean, it is highly irresponsible on their part to give such an answer. Had there been an RTI regarding a source, regarding something which had been published in their own textbook, how can they claim that they printed something without authenticating it, first of all? Secondly, the official should have consulted the historian who had written that particular passage of the textbook and should have let him answer from where that particular passage had been taken out from. Secondly, I would like to answer before Audrey takes it up is that, a number of journalists asked this question to me yesterday and day before yesterday. How would you respond to that? I gave a detailed answer to that. Unfortunately, Times Now, who was getting it recorded, only beamed half the sentence of what I had said on their channel. The other things were totally removed. So that is what is happening in the country. There is enough evidence. It is nothing very particular. M. Athareli has already worked on that. Satish Chandra has written much. Even the old NCRT books had a lot of material on that. I'm sorry I took that question on your behalf. Now, please, Audrey Truschke, if you have to say something on that.
No, that's really great, Nadeem. Because I think that's part of my answer is you all don't need me on this issue. Like, you have a lot of great historians in India who wrote these textbooks and who do research on this period. To the extent that you want my perspective, I wrote you a book on Aurangzeb, and it has all the notes, it has all the references. You can look at that. But I have had nothing to do with the writing of these textbooks, and I don't really think that you need my intervention. One observation that I would make is that this controversy, like so many that we've seen in recent years in India, it has nothing to do with the past. Right? This is not some disagreement on Mughal history. Like, it's unarguable that Aurangzeb Alamgir gave land grants to temples. Of course, like all historians know this, of that period. This is about the present, right? This is about maligning modern day Muslims. It's about attacking a specific community and a religious minority in India. The past is just this sort of, it's this convenient battleground. But it's not like there's some real historical question here.
Right. Let us take up the question of Shabbir Hassan Khan. Shabbir writes, as you are an experienced Sanskritist, I was wondering if you could perhaps clarify which of the below verbs you would regard as incorrect and why. Thanks very much in advance. Now I think you can read Sanskrit. I am unable to read it. So Audrey, you please read and try to answer him.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit difficult to deal with out of context. With this is, I'm not sure what the point of this question is, right? I mean, these are generally verbs with some unusual endings. I don't know. Is this designed to see if I know my declension tables?
Right.
I would suggest that we move on to a question that perhaps has greater general interest.
Yeah, Sagnik Sarkar, very illuminating talk. I agree. Especially the aspect of honoring Islamic kings by an allegory in Hindu mythological figures. We can see this in Bengal too, as the famed Hussain Shah is lauded in some Bengali and Sanskrit texts as Krishna personified.
Mm. That's very interesting. And I'm glad you brought up Bengal. So I didn't have an opportunity to do this in the talk, but in the book, I discuss, so as I said, there's great geographical diversity in the texts, the historical works that I cover. Kashmir down to Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, but not over to Bengal. So Bengal is an exception. I found Sanskrit historical works on Indo-Muslim rule from basically every other major part of India, and nothing from Bengal. And that's very interesting. And part of why it's interesting is that Bengal has historically had a pretty strong Muslim population, right? And that's something that Richard Eaton has detailed, where it came from and how that came about. And so at first I was sort of puzzled by that, like why do we have nothing in Bengal? And at the end of the day, what I sort of put forward as a theory, and it is a theory in the book, so reminder, historians work in degrees of accuracy rather than sort of absolute truth most of the time. So it is just a theory, but my theory in the book is that people living in Bengal had a different story to tell. And it was not a story focused on Indo-Muslim rule, but rather a story of fairly widespread conversion to Islam, which is unusual, right? Most of the subcontinent did not experience that at any point in the past. And so for them, that it comes out in different ways because it's a sort of different kind of narrative rather than a historical interest. So that's my theory on the Bengal exception.
Ali, Heather has another question for you. Was Sanskrit considered by Muslims as a language of Hinduism, as Arabic is considered as the language of Islam, or they used to learn it without any attachment of religion?
Honestly, that really depends on your Muslim, doesn't it? So for somebody like Al-Biruni, right, 10th, 11th century, I mean, for him, Sanskrit was like this key gateway into Hindu thought, right? You read his India, that's very clear. But there were definitely Muslims throughout history that we're not really sure why and how, but they learned Sanskrit and then just wrote Sanskrit text. So I'm thinking there's this Sandesha Kavya, this sort of messenger poem written by Abdur Rahman, possibly. I would have to double check the name, but anyway, I want to say it's 14th century, and it's just this nice messenger poem. Other than the guy has a Muslim name, there's nothing else that scholars have identified as Muslim or Islamic about it. So I think you had people doing different stuff.
Mikey Nax says that a nice piece of research, it will be oxygen for the unbiased real history. Well, I hope so. The only difference is that this is not the first lecture of its kind. I mean, historians have been working on these lines since a long period of time. And the results you can see, I mean, ask Audrey, I mean, go to her, Twitter account and you will find the reactions to that. We are living in strange times. No one is actually ready to hear whatever we have to say, but it is our duty to keep on repeating. So whether it influences the government of the day, whether it influences the others or not, but we as historians are supposed to narrate the facts, and people like Audrey would keep on doing that, whatever the consequence might be. Now, there is a question by Uttam Satpathy. Did the writing of Persian histories any way influence the writing of narratives of past in vernacular language? Because there is a spurt of such vernacular narratives post 13th century.
That's $1 million question, right? So other scholars have tried to connect these things. Did this sort of advent of Persian tarikhs in India, did that somehow spur vernacular stuff? Did it spur Sanskrit historical writing, right? This is a question I pose in my book, but I don't answer it. I don't think I have the evidence to answer it right now. And the links, I mean, people have tried to find them, and it's hard. It's hard to recover that from the past. So to me, it remains very tantalizing. There's a lot of sort of circumstantial evidence, right? Like a lot of stuff occurring around the same time that it's a little hard to believe that there weren't connections, but exactly what the connections were, we don't know. To just name one from my project, I have no concrete evidence that any of the 36 Sanskrit authors I discuss read Persian Tariq. Maybe some of them did. It's hard to believe, especially that Lakshmipati, it's hard to believe he didn't. Like, he clearly knows Persian. But like, without hard evidence, you know, what more can you do? You can sort of say maybe, but you can't really go beyond that. So I look forward to somebody else coming up with a more sort of creative way of using historical method to maybe prove some of that.
Right. Hassan Aziz asks a question. I want to ask that, did you mention Allah Upanishad written during Akbar's period as one of the Sanskrit narratives of Indo-Muslim rule? And is there any Sikh source in Sanskrit about Indo-Muslim rule?
That's interesting. Man, I haven't thought about the Allah Upanishad in a long time. That's a text that comes up in Culture of Encounters, my first book. You know, so I don't mention it here in this project because it's not historical in nature. You know, it's very late, despite having the word Upanishad. I mean, the Upanishads continue to be written into the late 16th century, at least. You know, yeah, it's just not historical. I should say I have the same issue with Purana literature, right? So in the Bhavishya Purana in particular, right, has this sort of Purana of the future, has like these sections on the Mughals, but like, we don't know who wrote this text. We don't know when. It could be like 18th century, some of the parts. So it's a little hard for me to work with those. So it doesn't come up. In terms of Sikh or Sikh sources, no, none of that appears in my work.
Well, he follows up with another question, Hassan Aziz, regarding Bahadur Shah Zafar. Bahadur Shah Muazzam deserved to be called the last great Mughal emperor rather than Emperor Aurangzeb because he quelled all the rebellions.
So historically speaking, I'm not clear he actually did quell all the rebellions. Like, he quelled some rebellions and he died after 5 years on the throne. And then, like, you know, things like went downhill pretty fast. So like, on a historical point, I don't know that I'm fully with you there. But I think the broader issue is like, why are we naming great Mughal emperors? Like, as far as I know, there's no historical like question or value that like rests in that balance. So I have nothing to say on it. Like, call him a great Mughal emperor if you want. Call yourself a great Mughal emperor, right? Like, what rests on that?
Have you answered this question by Digvijay Singh, Dr. Audrey? You did. Yes. So there is a question by Sagnik Sarkar. Sagnik Sarkar asked, was there any distinction in the treatment of ethnic Islamic power factions in the Mughal court? For example, that is Chagatai, Persian Khorasanis, and Afghans in Sanskrit texts of the period, or are they homogeneously seen through the prism of their Muslim identity?
That's a great question. So, I mean, obviously, so far as the Persian tradition goes, like, you know, ask the, you know, various people at Aligarh about that. You guys have done all the great research on that. But in Sanskrit texts, so early on, they're like way before the Mughals, like in the 12th, 13th centuries, there is this move in Sanskrit to sort of coin these new terms that are like pseudo-ethnic. So Turushka is the best example, right? This is Turk. That's where it comes from. Sorry, that was my phone. So they coined this term Turushka. And I think it's fair to ask, like, why didn't they coin Masula or Musulman or some other adaptation of Musulman, right? And I think that this emphasis on some sort of ethnic thing, it signals that religion was probably not like the key thing to them. But I think going further than that is a little hard for me on the basis of vocabulary. Another thing to note, so Turushka, for example, loses its specific meaning as Turk pretty fast, right? When referring to Muslims. And this actually gets confusing because then there are texts that use Truschke in like the 12th, 13th century, and we don't know whether they're referring to ethnic Turks or to Muslims, and those are not fully overlapping at that point. Like you have ethnic Turks that are not Muslim, so it gets very confusing. But certainly by like the 14th, 15th century, Truschke usually just means Muslim, right? It never fully loses its dual meaning as Turk, but it usually just means Muslim. So coming to the Mughal period, it's hard to look at vocabulary and sort of see any major distinction. I will say that the one case where I found sort of a serious attempt to distinguish comes in a text most commonly known as the Shiva Bharata, okay, but is actually called Surya Vamsha. This is a historical work sponsored by Shivaji, right, the sort of Maratha warlord turned king. And he, in this work, it refers to, for example, Uzbeks, right? And it uses, there's various Sanskrit terms, like the exact, letters change, but, it's Ujbeka or Ujbaka or something like this. And so there is this sort of attempt there, but it's just the Uzbeks, maybe one other group. Like it's not like he gives some like long list of like, oh, these are all the different groups. So it's hard to know what to make of that, right? It's a paucity of evidence. That's a great question.
Are there any other questions? If there are any, please put them up. And if there are no other questions or comments, I take this opportunity to once again thank Audrey Truschke. Well, there's a question by Leher Zedi. What are your thoughts on the Sanskrit Persian influence in the Sikh tradition? There are exquisite interchanges.
So I agree, there are exquisite interchanges, but that's pretty far outside of my areas of expertise. The only time I have ever published or written on Sikh history is when it intersects with Mughal history, right? That's sort of my limits in that regard.
Sheikh Ilyas.
Oh, that's good.
How far are these Jain narratives true when taken one-on-one with their contemporary Persian texts? If we talk about the encounter between Islam and Hinduism, how far the Sanskrit texts, which you mentioned in culture of counters, are useful?
So I don't like talking about Islam and Hinduism interactions. I know I do sometimes, going back to the intelligible vocabulary point. But honestly, I think it just makes more sense, especially in this context, to think about it as people, right? It's Muslims interacting with people we now call Hindu, right? Because they didn't call themselves Hindu by and large in these periods. And, the interactions are sort of all over the place. I can't characterize them in a sort of couple of sentences, right? It is really a diversity. The truth question, that is a great question. And that is one that I sort of dealt with over and over again in this book. So I would say this. I did not find an incredible amount of sort of clearly falsified information, right? Like, King A won a battle against King B in reality, but the text says King B won, right? So I didn't find much sort of really false information like that. I did find a lot of stuff, particularly in some of the Jain Prabandhas from the 14th century. This was very hot and heavy there. Stuff that we would consider to be ahistorical today, right? So divine interventions or a projection of Muslim identity going back to like BCE times, right? That's one interesting thing about the Jain Prabandhas. Some of them seem to assume that Muslims have always been in India and there's no need to explain how they came there any more than for like Buddhists or Jains or various Hindu groups. It's an interesting perspective, but it is ahistorical from modern eyes. So for that's where I think there's pressure on my sort of approach of having a loose definition of history and then trying to get a definition out of the texts themselves. And essentially, I just let that unease sit, right? It doesn't always have to be neatly tied up so that we modern historians trained in essentially a Western style of doing history so that we're comfortable, right? Like we can just be a little uncomfortable while reading these texts. I would also add that there are details in these works that are not available from other sources, right? And that is interesting. right? When you actually get more details, particularly in Lakshmipati's works, there are details of Mughal political intrigues that are referred to in other texts, but are only made explicit in Lakshmipati. In reading it, it was one of those. There's one section in particular, I won't spoil it. You all can read the book if you want to know what this is about, but like it's about the king's health. And Farrukh Siyar had health problems. It's referred to in other sources, but it's very vague. And then I was reading Lakshmipati, and it's like he goes into incredible detail about exactly what the health problem was. And it was like, whoa, like no one knows this. So there's that. Last thing, I know that I said that was the last thing, but the last thing I'll say on truth, sometimes there is selective omission in the texts. Okay, so for a good example is Jayanaka, the first guy who wrote. So he mentions the Chohan victory at Tarain in 1191. He does not mention the Chohan defeat at the same place the next year in 1192. However, Persian sources, a lot of Persian sources don't mention the 1191 Ghord defeat, right? They start with the 1192 Ghord victory. So selective recording was common for poets across the board.
There's a question, did the decline of the Mughal Empire have any effect on Sanskrit patronage, especially across North India?
I think the short answer to that is no. So the Mughals had cut all ties with Sanskrit intellectuals far before their decline. That was an early action undertaken by Aurangzeb Alamgir. I have argued he did that in order to distinguish his style of rule from Dara Shikoh, his major rival for the throne. Okay, you can look at both Culture of Encounters and my Aurangzeb book for an explanation of that. More generally, Sanskrit, there's two ways of looking at this. One is that sort of really like good creative production in Sanskrit was in decline before the decline of the Mughal Empire, right? That the sort of last hurrah of Sanskrit was in the 17th century, right? So that, they were close temporally, but not connected. A second argument is that the sort of so-called death of Sanskrit has been severely overblown, and that Sanskrit texts actually continued to be produced well into the 18th century. If you take that line, then Sanskrit intellectual production continues basically unaffected throughout the decline of the Mughals. So either way, either argument you want to take, it's not about the Mughals there.
There's a question by Dr. Aftab Alam. Following the footsteps of Derrida's tradition of deconstruction text to be located and interpreted in its context, in his historiography, to what extent a text can be relied upon until has been verified and compared with other material historical sources of that particular time. More than this, most of such texts mentioned and analyzed by you have also the natural propensity to suffer from personalized biases and extrapolation of particular events mentioned by these texts. Lastly, what are the significant distinctions in the methodologies of original Persian sources and other Indian language and other Indian languages, including Sanskrit, which belong to the great tradition of Hinduism?
So there's a lot there. That last question, that's a big one. And my book is not a comparative one. So, I mean, honestly, one hope for the book is that it might help lay some of the groundwork for someone to do a more meaningful comparative study. I think many prior attempts at comparative studies of that sort have been too vague, right, and too sort of general to be meaningful up until now. In terms of the sort of, historical sources and deconstruction, so you're not going to get very far with Derrida with me. All right, that's not a philosopher that I find useful in any sense of that term. I do agree with your general idea, though, that yes, of course you have to put texts in their context and you have to weigh them against other sorts of historical materials. But I'm going to turn that back on you. So for all of you who have been reading Persian texts without comparing them to texts in other languages, you're welcome for bringing your attention to a body of materials that you can use for comparison and verification.
Right. Zainab Naqvi asks, first, thanks you for your presentation. As a student tutored in historical method, my question to you is, how can we historicize and differ fact from fiction when using such narratives like the Kavya as historical sources? Should it be through source criticism and corroboration with other contemporary narratives, or Is there a way we can see such sources as standalone ones?
Hmm. That is a good and complicated question. I think it gets a little bit into the weeds. So I'll say a few things. So first off, this is not unique to reading Sanskrit Kavya. Like if you've been reading Persian Tariq and you don't think you're reading literature, like you are, right? So if you're not dealing with that and how you're reading Tariq, like you have a serious problem. This is an issue with all pre-modern histories, basically. You know, I think that there's a couple of ways to go about this. One is, as you suggest, you compare it to other sources, right? Can I corroborate this? And I think that's fair, especially for like, you know, sort of big stuff like who's winning what battles and who's in control when and that sort of thing. I think that you can get stuff that it doesn't necessarily have a name and a date, but there's other sorts of historical information, right? So one thing I do in the book, I trace evolving views of the Muslim other, right? And that's not, you know, that's not necessarily contingent on like who's in power and who is in what city at what point, right? But more of an intellectual history focus, right? Historians care what people thought and how people define themselves in addition to sort of hard political history, right? Politics is not everything. And then I think you can sort of understand text within their sort of broader tradition, right? And so this is where, and I tried to demonstrate this a little bit in the talk with Ganga Devi, where sort of knowledge of the sort of Sanskrit literature and Sanskrit tropes can help you see historical specificity expressed through them, because you can sort of ask why this trope, why not like myriad of other options, and you sort of have a sense of how to read it because you know how Sanskrit poets sort of think and work. So I think those are some of the sort of tools that we might use critically.
Right. Thank you very much. Is there any other question? I think that is Ali Hadar. Do you think similar words between Persian and Sanskrit played any role in writing of Sanskrit narratives of Indo-Muslim rule?
No. So, I mean, Sanskrit and Persian, they are related languages, if very distantly, right? They both come from the Indo-European language family tree, but nobody knew that at the time. The only time where I really saw sort of play in this regard, or at least the most obvious time, is in Lakshmipati. There's one verse in particular where he plays on the similarity between gostani, which is a Sanskrit word for a bunch of grapes, and gosht, meat. But, you know, it's thin evidence on that.
Which Muslim ruler patronized or knew Sanskrit more than any other Muslim ruler? Are there any?
So the big patrons in town are going to be the Mughals, Akbar through Shah Jahan, and then Prince Dara Shikoh and Zain al-Abidin and the Shah Miris. Whether any of them knew Sanskrit, that is a different matter.
Right, there's a question by Umakant Mishra. Umakant Mishra asks a question: do you see a parallel between Islamization of East Bengal and Indonesia? How do you explain such metamorphosis in the landscape so fast?
So I have nothing really to say in response to a comparison with Indonesia. It's a bit beyond what I tend to work on. In terms of explaining it, so I've never tried to do that, but Richard Eaton has in the, what's the book called, Nadeem? Social History of the Bengal Frontier? Yeah. So check out that book. It's a great book.
Well, I think we should, there's a limit to questions. I mean, people would keep on asking. And I think we should stop now because it is almost 2 hours since we had Audrey with us. Thank you very much. At least at a personal level, I learned a lot. Last time when you delivered a lecture on these sources at Aligarh, I had promised that I would not be putting them up on the YouTube or on the video. I still have them, but I have not put them up. But this one, as you know, is live both on YouTube and on Facebook.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. This is really my pleasure. To answer the final question, the book comes out in 3 days in India.
And you are remarkable. There was a question in between when would your last book come? Let me inform that Amazon informs. I have also pre-ordered the book, and the book is supposed to be out in India on 18th of January, just 2 or 3 days. You have to wait for that. And very soon they would be shipping it to your addresses. And if in case some of you are interested, all the books of Dr. Audrey Truschke, they are available on Amazon, from where you can order and get them. And mark you, each of those books go a long way to clear a number of misconceptions which you may be having about our past. Although, as I said in the beginning when I was introducing her, that she became very, very famous with a book on Aurangzeb, myth or reality. When a large number of people who were convinced that myths are the facts, they started attacking her. And but one thing which I really admire as far as her personality is concerned is that she never budged, not for a moment. I mean, a weaker person, I mean, you just have to go and witness it on the Twitter, the type of comments and the type of attacks which have been made on her. Even when we put up the poster of today's lecture, nasty comments started coming. I mean, the more she's attacked, the more I believe that she's talking the truth. She's, as I said, not the first to come up with those ideas about Aurangzeb. The only difference between the earlier works, say, of Athar Ali or Satish Chandra or other historians, was that they were quite, thick to understand, not comprehensive enough for the masses to understand. The book on Aurangzeb by Audrey Truschke has been written in a way that anyone, even if you do not have a background of history, can understand that. The first book she had written about the Sanskrit in the Mughal court, that I find a remarkable work, a work of a real scholar. Although I don't know why it did not bring her so much fame as this controversial book on Aurangzeb did. I am really very, very much looking forward to read the third book, to which you exposed people like us last year, and today you explained, especially I like the way when you started with the three misconceptions, the three untruths, and you started dealing with them and told us what the actual fact is. And the fact is that history is something which should be read critically, as scholars like Audrey Truschke are doing. Thank you very much. Day after tomorrow, we have another great scholar who would be with us. Once again, very controversial. Once again, a person who never stops to speak. I will just in one moment narrate that when the revolution of Iran took place, after the revolution, there was a meeting held at Aligarh, organized by a large number of Iranian students who were here at Aligarh during that period of time. Irfan Habib was asked to speak on the Inqilab. For around 40 minutes, he kept on speaking about the history of Iran, and everyone was lapping up things. But then he came to the point, and today the Shah has fled and Khomeini has come back to Iran. And after this sentence, when he started criticizing, the Khomeini the whole philosophy which was there. There was an uproar. He had to be escorted out. This happened thrice. People were on the verge of beating him up, but he did not budge even for a single second. He would come back and he would start from the same position as he was. I was among those who was in favor of the Iranian Revolution, but that was the day when I really came to know that why this scholar should be respected. And that is something which is common to both these scholars of this week, Audrey Truschke and Irfan Habib. Whatever their beliefs, you may believe whatever they have written, you may disagree with them, but as far as they are concerned, they believe it with full conviction. Thank you very much, Audrey, and keep working, keep giving us more and more work which would clear the webs in our minds. Thank you.
Thank you so much.